First things first, we're going to be installing a new HDMI port on this PlayStation 5. We already moved the old port in a previous video if you want to check that out. Before we install the port, we're going to need to put a little solder mask on the second and third pads down where the 100 nanofarad 201 SMD capacitor goes. Normally you wouldn't need any solder mask, but it's been worn off on those two pads, bridging the spot where the capacitor goes, where the end of the HDMI port tabs go. So we're going to put a little solder mask on those two pads. Off camera, we're going to go ahead and cure the solder mask with a UV light. Now that the solder mask is cured, we're going to go ahead and tin those two pads with some solder. Now that the two pads have solder where the capacitor goes, we're going to put a little flux on there, and then we'll get ready to put the capacitor on. We're going to turn the board so it'll be easier to hold the capacitor with the tweezers, and then we're going to start applying hot air to attach the capacitor. We're going to go ahead and lay the capacitor near where it goes, and the flux is going to help hold it there until we get the solder liquefied. The capacitor looks big on the screen, but it's actually microscopic in size. We're actually going to use a finer pair of tweezers to hold this capacitor, and we're going to start applying some hot air to the board and the capacitor. It's going to take a little time to get the board hot enough to liquefy the solder. The PlayStation 5 boards are multiple layers thick. And the capacitor's stuck down a little bit, but not with a good connection, so we're going to replace the tweezers and get it hot again. The air temperature is 400 degrees Celsius. We're going to apply the hot air in real time and not sped up. That way you can see how long this process actually takes. And there we go. We've got the capacitor soldered on. We'll go ahead and check, make sure it's on there secure. And we're ready to move on to the next step. We're going to go ahead and clean this area up with some isopropyl alcohol and a Q-tip. You can see how much smaller the capacitor is compared to the end of a Q-tip. Just going to make sure this whole area is squeaky clean. If the capacitor is not secured, when you're wiping over it with a Q-tip and isopropyl alcohol, sometimes it'll come off right on the Q-tip. So by rubbing over this one with some isopropyl, we know it's secured. Now we're going to go ahead and sit the port on there as a dry run. Make sure all the tabs line up with the pads. And we're going to go ahead and apply some flux, a nice healthy amount. And then we're going to start attaching the pads to the tabs. And this first try we use way too big of a tip and kind of try to drag the solder across, and it ends up bridging all these tabs here. So we're going to end up having to remove this port and then solder each tab individually. This is just a learning experience for me, so this is the first time. That's why it's going this way and not as smooth as in past videos. Now we're going to take some solder wick and clean these pads up where that port was so that we can grab a fresh port and try again. Alright, we've got a second port on here. We're going to go ahead and apply a healthy amount of flux again and get the soldering iron hot. We're going to throw a little background music on while we run down and solder these pins here. When we were checking all the pins to make sure they're attached securely, we found one that's not. So we're going to go ahead and re-hit that one with the soldering iron. We're going to re-hit that third pin with the iron, and then we're going to check it again with the tweezers and make sure that we got it secured this time. And then we're going to clean that area up with a Q-tip and some isopropyl alcohol. The last thing we have to do is solder the 4 legs to the board. This is going to hold the port in place when you're plugging and unplugging the connector. We'll put some flux on here, and then we're going to use a pretty big tip on the iron so that we can get enough heat transferred to the board and the port to get everything liquefied and in place. Flip the board over and apply solder to the top side of those pins to make sure that everything's secured on both the top and the bottom of the circuit board. We'll move over and do the other 2 legs on the other side of the connector now. And now we're finished soldering, so we're going to clean the whole board up, both sides, with some isopropyl and some Q-tips to get all the flux removed. And we're finished with this one.